February 14th, 1929, 6:47 a.m. Eliot Ness's hand was steady as he gripped his Thompson submachine gun. 50 federal agents surrounded the warehouse on South Wabash, $2 million worth of illegal alcohol inside. Al Capone trapped with nowhere to run. The plan was foolproof. Storm the building. Arrest everyone inside. End Capone's empire in one raid. Ness kicked down the door. The warehouse was empty, completely empty, except for one man sitting calmly at a desk in the center, reading the morning newspaper. Al Capone looked up, smiled, and said 7 words that made Ness question everything he thought he knew about law enforcement. "Good morning, Agent Ness. Care for coffee?" What nobody knew, what the federal government would never admit, is that Al Capone had known about the raid for 2 weeks. And what he did in those 2 weeks didn't just save his operation, it turned the most powerful law enforcement raid in Chicago history into the FBI's most embarrassing failure. To understand what happened that morning in the warehouse, you need to understand who Eliot Ness was in February 1929. He wasn't just another federal agent. He was the government's secret weapon, the man handpicked to destroy Al Capone when every other approach had failed. The Treasury Department called his team the Untouchables because they couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. By 1929, Ness had been hunting Capone for 8 months. His team had raided 43 speakeasies, destroyed 37 delivery trucks, and arrested over 200 Capone associates. They'd seized millions in illegal alcohol and shut down key distribution routes. Politicians in Washington were calling Ness a hero. Newspapers were comparing him to frontier lawmen. And Eliot Ness, 26 years old and absolutely certain of his mission, believed he was about to make the arrest of the century. But there was one problem. His name was Al Capone. Capone had built something the federal government couldn't understand. It wasn't just a criminal organization. It was an information network that stretched through every level of Chicago society. Bartenders, taxi drivers, hotel clerks, newspaper boys. They all had Al Capone's interests at heart, because Al Capone had their interests at heart. The feds had tried everything. Surveillance teams, undercover operations, wiretaps, financial investigations. Every time they got close, Capone was one step ahead. Every raid hit empty buildings. Every arrest warrant was served to men who'd already left town. Every investigation led to dead ends and destroyed records. By February 1929, the federal government was desperate, and desperate men make expensive mistakes. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Bureau of Investigation, approved the biggest law enforcement operation in Chicago history. 50 agents, military-grade weapons, warrants for Al Capone, and 30 of his top lieutenants. The plan was simple. Hit the main facility where Capone stored his alcohol, arrest everyone inside, and end his empire in one devastating blow. "This time we've got him," Ness told his team at the briefing. "Intelligence confirms Capone will be at the South Wabash location at 7 a.m. for the weekly distribution meeting. We hit hard, we hit fast, and by noon Al Capone is in federal custody." The agents loaded their weapons, checked their equipment, and prepared for the raid that would make their careers. None of them suspected they were walking into a trap that had been set 2 weeks earlier. But here's what the federal agents didn't understand about Chicago in 1929. The city wasn't just Al Capone's territory. It was his extended family. Every person who poured drinks, drove cabs, or swept floors had a connection to someone who worked for Capone. And when the federal government started asking questions, that family started talking. February 1st, 1929, 13 days before the raid, Tommy O'Brien was polishing glasses at Murphy's Tavern on the north side when a federal agent walked in. The agent thought he was being subtle, ordering whiskey and asking casual questions about liquor suppliers. But Tommy had been pouring drinks in Chicago for 15 years, and he could spot federal agents like a bartender spots watered-down whiskey. 2 hours later, Tommy was in the back office of the Four Deuces, reporting to Jake Guzik, Capone's financial manager. "Federal boy at Murphy's," Tommy said, asking about distribution deliveries, specifically mentioned South Wabash. Guzik listened carefully, made notes, and within an hour every bartender, cab driver, and hotel clerk in Capone's network had received a simple message: watch for federal agents asking questions about operations. What the federal government didn't understand about Al Capone's Chicago is that it wasn't held together by fear or money alone, it was held together by mutual benefit. Capone employed thousands of people directly and indirectly. His speakeasies provided jobs for bartenders, musicians, and security guards. His liquor distribution employed drivers, workers, and accountants. His gambling operations supported dealers, runners, and collectors. When federal agents started asking questions about Capone's operations, they weren't just threatening Al Capone, they were threatening the livelihood of half the working-class people in Chicago. And those people, without being asked, without being threatened, started reporting back to the organization that kept food on their tables. Over the next week, the reports came in like pieces of a puzzle. Federal agents renting rooms near the South Wabash facility. Government cars parked on side streets with clear views of the building. Phone company workers installing new lines that nobody had requested. Treasury Department officials meeting with Chicago police commanders behind closed doors. By February 10th, Al Capone knew exactly when the raid would happen, how many agents would be involved, and which doors they planned to use. But instead of running, instead of fighting, Capone made a decision that would become legend in Chicago. He would let them come, and he would teach them a lesson about the difference between law enforcement and true power. Clear out the facility, Capone told his lieutenants at a meeting in the Lexington Hotel. Every bottle, every barrel, every piece of equipment, store it in the backup locations. But leave the desk, leave one chair, and leave tomorrow's newspapers. Boss, why not just burn the place down? Asked Frank Nitti. Because, Capone replied, lighting a Cuban cigar, sometimes the best way to win a war is to let the enemy think they've won the battle. February 13th, 1929, the night before the raid. While Eliot Ness and his team made their final preparations, Al Capone's organization executed the most efficient evacuation in criminal history. Trucks rolled up to the facility under cover of darkness. Within 6 hours, $2 million worth of illegal alcohol had been redistributed to 12 different locations across Chicago. By dawn, the building contained nothing but vacant space, dust, and one mahogany desk with a single chair. But Capone wasn't finished. He had one more surprise for Agent Ness, something that would turn the raid from a law enforcement operation into a public relations disaster for the federal government. Here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Al Capone didn't just know the raid was coming. He knew exactly how to use that knowledge to destroy the federal government's reputation while building his own legend. This wasn't just about avoiding arrest. This was about proving a point that would echo through Chicago for decades. At 6:30 a.m. on February 14, 1929, Al Capone walked into the cleared facility alone. He carried a thermos of coffee, the morning edition of the Chicago Tribune, and a briefcase full of documents. He sat at the desk, opened the newspaper to the sports section, and waited. At exactly 6:47 a.m., he heard the sound of 50 federal agents surrounding the building. When Eliot Ness kicked down the door, expecting to find a room full of criminals and evidence, he found something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his career. Al Capone completely alone, reading the newspaper like he was sitting in his own living room. "Good morning, Agent Ness," Capone said without looking up from the paper. "Care for coffee?" The sight was so surreal, so completely wrong, that Ness actually hesitated. 50 armed federal agents, ready for war, faced one man calmly offering refreshments. "Al Capone, you're under arrest," Ness finally said, raising his weapon. "For what?" Capone asked, gesturing around the vacant space. "Reading the newspaper, drinking coffee. Show me the crime, Agent Ness." That's when Ness realized the magnitude of what had happened. The facility was completely vacant. No alcohol, no equipment, no evidence of any crime whatsoever. They had warrants to arrest 30 people, but there was only one person in the building. They had prepared for the raid of the century, but there was nothing to raid. "Where is everyone?" Ness demanded. "Where's the alcohol?" Capone folded his newspaper carefully and smiled. "What alcohol, Agent Ness? This is a perfectly legal storage facility. I rent it for furniture distribution." He gestured to a few wooden crates in the corner. "As you can see, business has been slow." But Capone wasn't done humiliating the federal government. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are the rental agreements for this facility, Agent Ness. All legal, all properly filed with the city. Would you like to see them?" The documents were perfect: legitimate business licenses, proper tax records, rental agreements that showed the building being used for furniture storage and distribution. "This is impossible," Ness said. "Our intelligence confirmed." "Your intelligence was flawed," Capone interrupted. "But don't worry, Agent Ness. Everyone makes mistakes, even the federal government. That's when Capone delivered the blow that would end Eliot Ness's effectiveness in Chicago. He pulled out the morning newspaper and showed Ness the front page. The headline read, "Federal Raid Planned for Capone Facility, Exclusive Details Inside." The article published that morning contained every detail of the planned raid: the time, the location, the number of agents, even the names of the team leaders. "You know what's funny about newspapers, Agent Ness?" Capone said. "They're usually printed the night before, which means this story was written yesterday, which means everyone in Chicago knew about your secret raid before you even woke up this morning." The blood drained from Ness's face as he realized what had happened. The raid hadn't failed because of bad intelligence. It had failed because there was no such thing as secret intelligence when you were fighting Al Capone in his own city. "How?" Ness whispered. Capone stood up, straightened his tie, and picked up his thermos. "Agent Ness, you came to Chicago thinking you could fight crime with guns and badges, but Chicago doesn't work that way. In this city, information is power, loyalty is currency, and respect can't be enforced with federal warrants." He walked toward the door, pausing next to the confused federal agent. "You want to arrest me for something, Agent Ness? Next time, focus on paperwork. It's much harder to make tax documents disappear with a phone call." As Al Capone walked out of the building, 50 federal agents watched in stunned silence. They'd planned the perfect raid and caught nothing but vacant air. They'd brought enough firepower to fight an army and faced one man with a newspaper. But what happened next proved that Capone's victory was about more than embarrassing the federal government. It was about demonstrating to all of Chicago that intelligence, preparation, and community loyalty could defeat any amount of government force. Within hours, the story was all over Chicago. Not the version the federal government wanted to tell, but the version Al Capone had orchestrated. The raid became a symbol of federal incompetence and Capone's untouchable status. Local newspapers ran the story for days, each retelling making Capone look more brilliant and the feds look more foolish. Eliot Ness requested a transfer out of Chicago the following month. The untouchables were quietly disbanded and reassigned. The federal government abandoned large-scale raids against Capone's organization, focusing instead on financial crimes that couldn't be solved by bribing the right bartender or cab driver. But here's what most people miss about that Valentine's Day morning. Al Capone had accomplished something far more significant than avoiding arrest. He had proven to an entire city that the federal government's power had limits, while his own power seemed to have none. The facility on South Wabash became a tourist attraction. People would walk by just to see the place where Al Capone made the federal government look like amateurs. Bartenders across Chicago told and retold the story, each version adding new details that made Capone seem more prescient and the feds more incompetent. In the speakeasies that night, people raised their glasses not just to Al Capone, but to the idea that a man with enough intelligence and community support could outsmart the entire federal government. It was a lesson that would inspire criminals and fascinate law-abiding citizens for generations. Years later, when Al Capone was finally convicted on tax evasion charges, people in Chicago still talked about that Valentine's Day morning when one man with a newspaper defeated 50 federal agents with machine guns. They talked about it because it proved something that Chicago had always known, but the federal government had never understood. In the city of broad shoulders, respect isn't given to those with the most power. It's given to those who know how to use power wisely. The real lesson of that morning wasn't about law enforcement or criminal justice. It was about the difference between force and intelligence, between having power and understanding power. Al Capone had shown an entire city that true strength doesn't come from weapons or badges. It comes from knowing your community, understanding your enemy, and always staying 3 moves ahead. Chicago's working people, the bartenders, cab drivers, hotel clerks, and shop owners, had chosen sides that day. Not because they were criminals, but because Al Capone had proven he understood something the federal government didn't: power shared is power multiplied. Every person who reported federal activity wasn't just helping Al Capone, they were protecting their own community from outside interference. That lesson would echo through Chicago for decades. Local politicians learned to work with community leaders rather than against them. Business owners understood that loyalty earned was more valuable than respect demanded. And law enforcement discovered that in a city like Chicago, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the criminal with the biggest gun force, it was the criminal with the biggest network. The morning of February 14, 1929 became more than just a failed raid. It became a masterclass in the art of winning without fighting, of using intelligence instead of violence, of turning an enemy's strength into weakness. Al Capone didn't just avoid arrest that day, he wrote the blueprint for how to defeat superior force through superior strategy. And that blueprint would be studied, copied, and admired by everyone from street criminals to corporate executives for generations to come. Because Al Capone had proven something that morning that changed how Chicago understood power forever. The most dangerous weapon isn't in your hand, it's in your head. If this story of intelligence, preparation, and the art of winning without fighting inspired you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that the greatest victories are won before the battle begins. Drop a comment below. How do you think Al Capone knew about the raid 2 weeks in advance? Turn those notifications on because next week we're telling the story of how Al Capone negotiated his way out of a death sentence by making a judge an offer he literally couldn't refuse. You won't want to miss it. Remember, in Chicago, power isn't about the size of your army, it's about the loyalty of your information network. And Al Capone built the best network in American history.